There's a moment in life when everything seems to be in place. The job, the relationships, the goals. Yet a quiet dissatisfaction lingers beneath it all. This is the invisible weight Andrea Owen addresses in her book, How to Stop Feeling Like Shit. 14 Habits That Are Holding You Back from Happiness Star. The book isn't about pretending to be positive or forcing fake gratitude. It's about confronting the subtle, self-defeating habits that slowly drain joy from our lives. Andrea Owen speaks from experience, not theory. Before becoming a life coach and author, she battled addiction, endured a painful divorce, and rebuilt her life from the ground up. That journey shaped her direct, no-nonsense approach. She doesn't promise quick fixes. Instead, she offers hard truths delivered with warmth. Reading her feels like having a brutally honest friend who tells you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. In this summary, we'll uncover the core lessons from Owen's book, how to recognize behaviors like people-pleasing, perfectionism, and constant self-doubt, and replace them with self-compassion and emotional honesty. Because as she wisely reminds us, get it wrong and try again. Rinse and repeat. Moving from that feeling of quiet dissatisfaction, one of the most common habits that feeds it is the urge to please everyone around us. It often begins as a desire to be kind or helpful, but over time it becomes something heavier, a quiet obligation to meet everyone's needs except our own. The author thinks this habit doesn't come from kindness at all, it comes from fear. We fear rejection, disapproval, or being seen as difficult. So we keep saying yes, even when we're exhausted. We smile through discomfort, agree when we disagree, and convince ourselves that keeping the peace is the same as being a good person. But there's a cost to constantly managing how others feel. The author describes how people-pleasing disconnects us from our true emotions. When we spend all our energy making sure others are happy, we lose touch with what actually makes us happy. Over time, resentment begins to grow quietly beneath the surface. It's not anger toward others, but a subtle disappointment in ourselves for never setting limits. The irony is that in trying to be liked, we end up feeling unseen. The author once admitted that her own people-pleasing looked like strength from the outside. She could handle everything: the workload, the emotional labor, the endless list of favors. But what she didn't realize was that her strength was really avoidance. By focusing on others, she avoided looking at her own pain. It took years before she understood that her constant, "I'm fine," was a shield, not a truth. The day she finally said no, without explaining or apologizing, she described it as both terrifying and freeing. It was the first moment she felt real instead of perfect. The author said this false version of strength is one of the biggest lies we tell ourselves. We call it independence, resilience, or being capable, but it often hides a deep fear of appearing weak. Many of us grew up believing that asking for help meant failure. So we build lives around control, doing everything alone, never letting others see us struggle. The problem is that this form of strength leaves no space for connection. When you're always the strong one, no one knows when you're breaking. True strength, the author thinks, has nothing to do with how much you can carry. It's about allowing yourself to be seen fully, including the messy, tired, uncertain parts. This kind of vulnerability doesn't make us fragile, it makes us honest. And honesty builds deeper relationships than perfection ever could. The moment we stop pretending to have it all together, we start giving others permission to do the same. That's how emotional connection begins to heal what people-pleasing once concealed. The book challenges readers to practice one small act of truth each week, something as simple as saying no to a request that doesn't align with your energy or values. The author insists that this isn't selfishness, but self-respect. It's a way of reminding yourself that your time and emotions matter. The discomfort that follows a boundary is temporary, but the peace that follows honesty lasts much longer. At the heart of this lesson is a powerful idea. You don't have to earn love through effort. People who truly care for you don't need you to perform for their approval. They just need you to be present and genuine. When you stop managing everyone else's emotions, you finally have space to understand your own. The author sums it up simply: life doesn't need to be perfect to be meaningful, and you're not living it wrong just because you're tired of pretending. Real strength begins when the mask comes off, and you let yourself be human. After breaking free from the need to please others, another invisible habit often takes its place: the urge to control everything. The author thinks that if people-pleasing feeds on approval, perfectionism thrives on control. It's that constant drive to get things exactly right, to organize every moment, to leave no space for mistakes. On the surface, this looks like responsibility or ambition, but underneath it often hides deep anxiety. The belief is simple but false. If everything is perfect, nothing can hurt us. The author said she once lived her life chasing this illusion. Every detail had to be flawless, the house spotless, the emails worded precisely, the body disciplined, the emotions managed. She thought perfection would create stability, but it only made her more fragile. When something unexpected happened, she fell apart because perfection doesn't prepare us for life's chaos. It only amplifies the fear of losing control. She calls this the myth of control, the idea that if we plan carefully enough, we can keep uncertainty away. The truth, she learned, is that control doesn't prevent pain, it prevents peace. Perfectionism also works quietly, making us believe our worth depends on performance. It's not just about doing things right. It's about being seen as someone who always has it together. The author thinks perfectionism is often mistaken for high standards, but the difference is emotional. Healthy ambition motivates. Perfectionism punishes. It whispers that mistakes are proof of failure, that good is never good enough. That voice keeps us endlessly fixing, polishing, editing, but never resting. In one part of the book, the author describes sending a simple email that she rewrote a dozen times before finally pressing send. She laughed later at how much time she wasted trying to sound just right. That moment became a lesson in awareness. The world didn't end. No one noticed the extra comma, and her fear of judgment was entirely imagined. It showed her how often perfectionism exaggerates consequences to keep us stuck. Once she started allowing small imperfections, she discovered a new kind of calm. Perfectionism and control also shape how we treat others. When we expect ourselves to be flawless, we often hold the same impossible standard for those around us. The author points out that perfectionists rarely mean to be critical, but they can become rigid because they measure love through performance. This creates distance, not closeness. True connection only happens when people feel safe to be imperfect together. The author believes that letting go of control isn't about becoming careless. It's about becoming compassionate. The antidote she offers is surprisingly practical. Try being imperfect on purpose. Leave the dishes undone for a night. Send the project before you've polished every line. Let someone help even if they won't do it your way. These small acts challenge the mind's belief that control equals safety. Over time, the discomfort fades, replaced by a sense of relief. You start to learn that the world doesn't collapse when you relax your grip. What changes instead is your ability to breathe again. The author said that real safety doesn't come from perfection, it comes from resilience. Life is unpredictable, and no amount of planning can change that. But resilience means trusting that you can handle whatever comes, even if it's messy. When we shift from control to confidence, we stop needing everything to be perfect before we feel at peace. The goal isn't to manage every outcome, but to stay grounded through every imperfection. By choosing progress over perfection, you create room for growth instead of guilt. You start to measure success not by flawlessness, but by courage. The courage to show up, try again, and keep going. As the author reminds readers, perfection is not a requirement for happiness. The freedom we want isn't found in getting everything right, but in knowing we'll be okay when things go wrong. After loosening our grip on control, another challenge quietly steps forward, the constant voice inside that says we're not good enough. The author calls this voice the inner critic, and it's not an enemy, but a frightened protector. It's the part of us that whispers doubts like, "You'll fail," or "You don't deserve this," hoping to keep us safe from rejection or embarrassment. The author thinks this voice develops early, shaped by moments when love or approval felt conditional. Over time, it becomes our inner roommate, always present, often uninvited, and rarely kind. The author said that at first, she tried to silence her inner critic through force, telling it to shut up or pretending it didn't exist. But that only made the voice louder. It turns out the critic doesn't respond to shame, it feeds on it. What changed everything was when she stopped fighting it and started listening. She began to ask, "What are you trying to protect me from?" That simple question turned judgment into understanding. The critic's words still came, but their meaning softened. Instead of hearing, "You're not ready," she learned to translate it as, "You're scared, and that's okay." This shift in perspective also reveals why imposter syndrome is so common. The author thinks imposter syndrome is just the inner critic wearing a different mask. It shows up when things go well, whispering that your success was luck, that one day everyone will see you don't belong. The more you achieve, the louder it gets, because growth triggers fear. When you step outside your comfort zone, your inner protector panics. It mistakes progress for danger. The author said that when her first major success arrived, instead of feeling proud, she felt terrified. She kept waiting for someone to call her out as a fraud. Only later did she realize the voice wasn't predicting failure. It was reacting to expansion. Understanding this makes it easier to respond with compassion instead of criticism. The author compares the inner critic to a bodyguard who's overreacting. It doesn't mean harm. It just doesn't know the difference between real threats and emotional risks. So instead of arguing, she suggests curiosity. When the critic shouts, pause and ask what it's trying to protect. Usually, it's fear of judgment, failure, or abandonment. Once you see that, the power dynamic changes. You're no longer being controlled by the voice. You're in conversation with it. But the critic has another sneaky strategy, self-sabotage. It's how fear disguises itself as logic. You procrastinate on a project because it's not the right time. You pick a fight right before a big moment. You downplay your ideas or avoid applying for something because you don't feel ready. The author said these behaviors aren't laziness or weakness. They're survival tactics that have outlived their purpose. The critic convinces you to hold back so you never have to face the pain of failure. Ironically, that's how it keeps you stuck. In one story, the author described a pattern of starting projects with excitement but never finishing them. Each time, she'd tell herself she was too busy or not prepared. Eventually, she realized it wasn't time she lacked. It was self-trust. Deep down, she was scared to see what would happen if she gave her best effort and it still wasn't enough. That insight was painful, but it opened the door to change. She stopped seeing self-sabotage as proof of failure and started viewing it as a clue to where she still needed healing. The author reminds readers that awareness is the first step toward breaking these loops. As she puts it, you can't change what you didn't know wasn't working. The moment you notice your patterns, the hesitation before saying yes, the excuses that sound too reasonable, you've already begun to interrupt them. The work isn't about pushing harder, but softening smarter. In the end, the author thinks the cure for self-sabotage isn't punishment, but compassion. The critic quiets down not when it's ignored, but when it feels heard. You don't need to erase the voice that doubts you. You just need to stop believing it's the truth. With time, its warnings become background noise, still there, but no longer in control. What replaces it is a quieter confidence, the kind that grows from patience, not perfection. After facing the inner critic, the next challenge often appears in silence. The quiet ways we try to escape what we feel. The author calls this numbing, and it's one of the most common habits that keep people stuck. When emotions get too heavy, we distract ourselves with endless scrolling, another drink, more work, or hours of mindless television. It feels harmless, even deserved, but the author thinks this behavior carries a hidden cost. As she puts it, you can't selectively numb. When you shut out pain, you also dull your ability to feel joy, connection, and meaning. She admits she once spent months living this way, convincing herself she was just taking a break. After painful personal losses, she numbed her grief with busyness. Work, errands, and small talk became shields against feeling. But instead of protecting her, those distractions deepened the emptiness. The emotions she tried to avoid didn't disappear. They just waited beneath the surface, growing stronger. The author said the turning point came when she realized that her escape habits weren't self-care. They were self-abandonment. Real healing began only when she stopped running from discomfort and allowed herself to feel it fully. Numbing is tricky because it often hides behind socially accepted habits. Overworking looks productive, oversharing online looks open, and staying too busy sounds responsible. But underneath, it's all the same pattern, a fear of sitting still long enough to face what hurts. The author thinks the way out isn't to remove comfort, but to build awareness. The next time you reach for your phone or pour another drink after a stressful day, pause and ask, What am I trying not to feel right now? That small moment of honesty can interrupt the automatic loop. It turns avoidance into awareness, which is where change starts. When numbing doesn't work, isolation often follows. We pull away from others because we believe our pain is too much to share. The author confessed that after her lowest point, she withdrew completely. She told herself she was protecting others from her sadness, but the truth was she felt unworthy of connection. Alone, her shame grew louder, convincing her she was the only one struggling. That loneliness became heavier than the pain she was trying to avoid. She later realized that connection doesn't require grand gestures or deep conversations. Sometimes, it's as simple as one honest text. Hey, I'm not doing great today. That small act breaks the illusion that you have to carry everything alone. The author said shame thrives in silence, but it loses its power when spoken. Reaching out doesn't erase the pain, but it softens it. It reminds you that being human means being imperfect and still deserving of love. Another habit that feeds both numbing and isolation is what the author calls catastrophe thinking. It's when the mind spirals from one small worry into an imagined disaster. You send a message and don't get a reply, and suddenly you're convinced you've said something wrong. A minor mistake at work becomes proof you're incompetent. The brain does this because it believes preparing for the worst equals safety. But as the author explains, it's an illusion of control. The fear feels useful, but all it really does is exhaust you. She teaches a small but powerful way to stop the spiral. When panic starts, pause and ask, what else could be true? Maybe the delay in reply means the person is busy. Maybe the mistake is small and fixable. This question doesn't deny reality, it expands it. It moves your mind from fear to logic, from helplessness to choice. The author thinks this habit slowly retrains the brain to see uncertainty not as danger, but as part of life. All three habits, numbing, isolation, and catastrophizing, share the same root, a fear of vulnerability. We fear being seen in our pain, so we hide behind distraction, distance, or endless what-ifs. Yet every time we choose awareness over avoidance, connection over withdrawal, and curiosity over panic, we take a small step back toward ourselves. The author reminds us that emotional courage isn't about having no pain. It's about staying present through it long enough to discover what's real underneath. After numbing and isolation, another quiet trap appears, the comparison loop. The author describes it as one of the inner critic's favorite hobbies. It starts with a scroll through social media or a glance at someone else's success. Suddenly, our own lives feel smaller. The comparison doesn't just measure, it distorts. We compare our behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel, and the result is always the same: inadequacy. The author thinks comparison thrives in disconnection. When we're disconnected from gratitude, our minds automatically fill the gap with judgment. She offers a simple yet powerful remedy: gratitude. Not the forced, just be grateful, kind, but active gratitude, noticing what's already working in your life. The author suggests writing down 3 things you appreciate whenever envy strikes, no matter how small. Maybe it's your morning coffee, a good conversation, or the way sunlight hits your desk. This tiny act redirects your focus from scarcity to abundance. It doesn't make comparison disappear, but it interrupts the habit before it consumes you. Over time, gratitude quiets the critic by reminding you that your story is unfolding at its own pace. Closely tied to comparison is blame, another habit that feels satisfying in the moment but slowly poisons growth. Blame gives us the illusion of control. It lets us point to someone or something and say, "That's why I'm unhappy." The author said she used to blame others for her unhappiness, her relationships, her job, her past. It felt easier than facing her own fear of change. But eventually, she saw that blame was just a clever disguise for helplessness. Every time we focus on who's at fault, we hand our power away. Her advice is to shift from blame to ownership. Instead of asking, "Who's to blame?" she encourages us to ask, "What can I do next?" That question doesn't excuse others' behavior. It simply returns the focus to what we can actually control: our response. Ownership doesn't mean guilt. It means choosing agency over victimhood. The author believes that this shift transforms energy from resentment into movement. It's the moment you stop waiting for someone else to change and begin shaping your own outcome. But there's one more subtle habit that locks us in place: cynicism. It's the voice that says, "Why bother?" Nothing ever changes. On the surface, cynicism looks like intelligence. It feels sharp, realistic, even protective. Yet underneath, it's often disappointment dressed as wisdom. The author said she once used sarcasm as a shield, dismissing hope to avoid being hurt again. But cynicism doesn't protect, it paralyzes. When you assume the worst, you close the door on possibility before it even knocks. To counter that voice, she recommends a gentler challenge. What if one good thing could happen? That small shift doesn't demand blind optimism. It simply creates space for hope. The author thinks hope isn't about pretending everything's fine. It's about allowing room for potential even when life feels uncertain. Practice daily. This habit rewires the brain to see opportunities where it once saw dead ends. Together, comparison, blame, and cynicism form a cycle of emotional stagnation. Comparison fuels dissatisfaction, blame traps us in the past, and cynicism kills motivation before it begins. But gratitude, ownership, and curiosity break the loop. The author reminds us that freedom doesn't come from changing who we are. It comes from changing how we see ourselves in relation to others, our past, and the future ahead. After uncovering the traps of comparison and blame, the real work begins: rebuilding. The author doesn't leave readers stuck in self-awareness. She offers a way forward. Her roadmap starts with one essential step: knowing what you truly value. Most of our destructive habits come from fear of rejection, judgment, or losing control. When decisions are driven by fear, we react instead of choose. But when actions come from values, everything shifts. The author thinks clarity around values is what anchors us during chaos. She suggests asking, "What do I want my life to stand for?" The answer becomes a compass for every decision. If you value authenticity, you stop pretending to have it all together. If you value connection, you send the message, make the call, or show up even when it feels awkward. Living by values doesn't erase discomfort, but it gives it purpose. The author said that when she started aligning her choices with honesty and courage, her anxiety didn't vanish. It transformed into energy for growth. Acting from values builds trust with yourself, and that self-trust becomes the quiet confidence that no perfectionist rule or coping habit can replace. Another shift she emphasizes is replacing judgment with curiosity. When life gets hard, most people ask, "What's wrong with me?" It's a question soaked in shame. The author encourages changing it to, "What's happening for me?" That tiny word swap moves the focus from self-blame to understanding. Instead of seeing challenges as proof of failure, they become information, signals showing where growth is needed. Curiosity doesn't excuse mistakes, but it removes the sting of shame long enough to learn from them. It's how emotional intelligence develops, not by suppressing emotion, but by decoding it. Self-compassion supports that process. The author knows many people flinch at the word because it sounds like weakness, but she argues it's the foundation of resilience. Compassion isn't about letting yourself off the hook. It's about refusing to add cruelty to your own struggle. When you speak to yourself with the same patience you'd offer a friend, healing becomes sustainable. Harshness might create short bursts of discipline, but kindness fuels long-term change. The author said that every time she softened her inner dialogue, she noticed her confidence returning naturally. Her mantra captures this truth: get it wrong and try again. Rinse and repeat. Progress, she reminds readers, isn't a straight climb. It's a messy loop of falling, learning, and rebuilding. Every time you choose awareness over autopilot or courage over comfort, you strengthen a new habit. Reviewers often point out that this message feels both grounding and hopeful. It replaces the fantasy of overnight transformation with the reality of daily practice. The author believes real change happens not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in small, consistent acts of courage. Choosing honesty instead of hiding, speaking kindly instead of critically, showing up imperfectly instead of waiting to feel ready. Over time, those moments form a new pattern, one built not from fear or approval seeking, but from integrity. That's how the cycle begins to break, one conscious choice at a time, until the person you're becoming starts to feel more like the person you've always been underneath. At the end of How to Stop Feeling Like Shit by Andrea Owen, the message becomes clear: This isn't a book about self-improvement in the traditional sense. It's not about turning yourself into someone new or erasing your flaws. It's about finally understanding why you do what you do and treating those patterns with compassion instead of shame. The author thinks that every so-called bad habit once served a purpose, a survival mechanism that kept you safe when you didn't know another way. Awareness, she says, is what turns survival into growth. Her honesty is what makes the book powerful. She doesn't write from a pedestal but from experience, the kind that leaves you cracked open and real. The author said that falling apart was the beginning of her freedom, not the end of it. Through her voice, you learn that rebuilding yourself isn't about strength without struggle, but courage through imperfection. For anyone watching or reading, the takeaway is refreshingly human. You don't need to fix everything today. Start small, one honest conversation, one boundary, one deep breath before reacting. Progress lives in those moments. As she reminds us, you're not doing life wrong. You're simply learning how to live it on your own terms.